Well, we're going to start on the second half now, and I'm thinking hopefully, it will be shorter than the first half of this very long chapter. And so now we're going to move from Swedish preschools into how doctors are involved in socializing with intersex children into gender socialization. For some children, in addition to the key socializers like parents, school, church, and the media, the medical community is actually a very important element in how they learn about gender. So, in the research about intersex children, the individuals who had repeated surgeries and medical examinations to quote, fix their problem often compared their experiences to sexual abuse. They felt that they had turned into a quote, freak show for doctors and other medical professionals. Two common experiences happened with intersex children in the medical profession. The first was putting their bodies on display, photographing them, etc., in the context of medicine in a hospital, but nonetheless, that's a very invasive thing. And second, doctors actually told them to conceal the truth of their intersex status and provided them with stories to explain any anomalies in their bodies to their future intimate partners. So coming out as intersex is an interesting thing. There's a lot of research on it, and there's a lot of things on the internet about it that you can look up on YouTube, etc. Jamie Lee Curtis is maybe the most famous. One assumes or thinks many ideas about whether she's intersex or not. She and her family have never verified that she is. She certainly very vociferously supported her trans daughter. So why are those negative experiences important? That the negative experiences that intersex children have important to our general understanding of gender socialization? Well, it's primarily because intersex individuals are important to the question of gender socialization, to the basic question. Um, their experience shows us that, at least in Anglo European society, being intersex is both a fascinating and a terrifying experience. Why is that? Because what it shows us is that in many cultures, there's such a rigid sex gender system that it needs to be protected from anyone like intersex people who might disrupt it or lead, even more important, lead to questioning it. What about the importance of peer groups? There, you all know how powerful that is. But first, we're going to look at a couple of family examples, and then we'll move into peer groups. So just think about, I don't know if you have, some of you must have siblings who are opposite gender from you. And growing up in a family, if you're a girl with a brother, or if you're a boy with a sister, your experiences are usually very different about gender socialization. Well, you are treated differently, each of you. For example, a brother would be allowed possibly very often to stay out later than a sister, or a sister would be scolded less harshly than a brother. Toys are different, as we've talked about, Barbie dolls versus Power Rangers. And what about peer groups? Okay. Oh, and your rooms might be painted differently too in your family, pink for girls, blue for boys, stereotypically. But what about peer groups? We haven't looked at that yet, and they are very, very powerful. So research shows that gender is important to how play is organized at school among young children, and that they're involved in gender-related activities. So people did research on primary school playgrounds. Generally, primary school, they've moved up to later grades, but this research is primarily younger kids. So the girls' games took up less space. They were things like jumping rope, monkey bars, that type of thing. The boys' games ranged over a much wider area of the playground. They played competitive sports like soccer and basketball. Sometimes the boys and girls did interact, and that affirmed gender boundaries with such things as pollution games like cooties, you remember that, and what's called enacting heterosexuality with taunts like Jimmy likes Betty or Betty likes Jimmy kind of thing. There were times when gender was less important, when a project was fun and absorbing and required cooperation, and now it was really nice to hear that that did occur sometimes. Now, this next section is called Slopes and Skirts, and it's about socialization into the gender of sports. I teach a sociology of sports course, and there's a chapter on gender weaves throughout the whole text, of course, but there's a whole chapter on gender and sports, and it's really fascinating to understand that whole dynamic. But here's a kind of a quick overview, playground kind of overview of that. So from a young age, parents show their deep-seated beliefs about gender and physical activities as they interact with their babies. Okay, so uh, let me tell you a quick story about a very well-known anthropologist. She's the daughter of Margaret Mead, who was a very famous anthropologist. Her name is Mary Catherine Bateson. She became an anthropologist like her mother. She was doing field work in the Middle East. I think it was Syria. I can't remember exactly what country. This is many, many years ago, by the way. But one of the research things she did was which was replicated, by the way, in the US. You might think, well, it's just Middle Eastern mothers who do this. No, it was more recently, than when she did it, was replicated in the United States. So she had moms and babies play on the floor, kind of in the middle of a big room, and she would just take notes about that. They'd be playing with a toy. Then Mary Catherine, would pick up the toy and move it to the far end of a room and just observe what occurred. Well, the baby would start fussing. The toy had been taken away, it had been moved. The baby, this is a crawling age baby, the baby could see the toy, and if it was a boy baby, what the mother would say is, "Go get it. Go on, you can get the toy. Go over there and go get it." And she'd point at the toy and encourage the kid to get it. But when it was a girl baby, and the baby would, and both babies, male and female, would go, they wanted the toy, they'd fuss or whatever, and that's when the mother would respond. With the girl baby, she would either immediately get up and go get the toy and bring it back, or if the girl baby started to move out on her own to get it, she'd pull the baby back by her clothing or something, or an arm or a leg. So that's an example of that. All right. So I bring that up because the next section is talking about in preschool settings, the movements of boys and girls are managed differently. Now, in this case, it has to do with clothing to a great extent in this particular research study. So, first of all, there's nothing that's inherently limiting about dresses or skirts. In fact, one could make the argument, as your author does, that they're actually less restricting of mobility. But the norms and rules little girls, even as young as 5, internalize about dresses and skirts dictate that they can't move in certain ways when wearing them. Okay? A girl wearing pants could put her feet up on a table, for instance, but not a girl in a dress. And the other thing is, skirts and dresses can be lifted up. And even very young girls have internalized how embarrassing that is. That's a favorite playground game, right? To go around and lift up little girls' skirts, okay? Even preschool girls partly monitor and patrol their own movement through clothing, which means that they're active participants in their own gender socialization, right? They're watching how much they're exposing, when they're wearing skirts and dresses themselves. But they're also disciplined by their teachers to be silent, to avoid conflicts, And all of that results in smaller body movements. Now, the boys' physical activity was also patrolled, as your book uses that term to mean managed, kind of, but not as successfully because they were more likely to ignore teachers and the consequences. And they took up more space. They used louder voices. So, and they had, uh, sometimes they used loud voices in conflicts with, and there was very little teacher intervention in those conflicts. In other words, teachers were rewarding and punishing different types of behavior based on gender. So, why does that even matter? Well, in this context of sports, it matters because research tells us that the crucial period for learning fundamental motor skills is between the ages of 2 and 8. During this time, between 2 and 8, the effects of learning experiences on the brain are especially strong. And physical skills, of course, can be learned outside of this window and often are, but they'll be more difficult to master. And typically, the athletes who begin their training or their learning, their skills after that period will never gain the same degree of proficiency as ones that began before 8. And so that explains why boys, on average, are better at fundamental motor skills like object control. Object control involves throwing, catching, and kicking, and body control, which involves agility. And parents and teachers they actually interact with boys and girls differently, which also leads to disparities in their physical activities. Girls usually start to play sports at a later age or drop out of sports at higher levels than boys do. But why? Why does that happen? Why do they enter sports later and drop out more frequently? It's complicated, of course, but there are several reasons. The first one is structural factors. There are just fewer opportunities for girls at early ages. And one estimate is that in high school alone, girls have a 1.3 million fewer opportunities in sports than boys. And then, of course, there's the peer influence aspect of the thing. Even in 2022, girls still face the possibility of being seen as too masculine or as gay for playing certain sports. That stigma, of course, varies by sport. And this is interesting. One study asked black and white students in the ninth and 10th grade about gender appropriateness in certain sports. So both the boys and girls across racial categories agreed that soccer, tennis, racquetball, and swimming were gender neutral. Softball and volleyball were seen as feminine. Now, it's interesting because black and white students disagreed on which sports were masculine. White students said baseball, basketball, and football, but black students were less likely to see baseball and basketball as masculine. So I'm assuming that they just chose football on that one since those were the choices. When asked why certain sports were better for one gender or the other, now these are all quotes, what I'm going to say here. For boys, it was because it's a physical contact sport, because boys like it, and because girls can't handle it. Sports for girls were best described because, these are quotes again, it's non-contact, less physical, girls are flexible, girls like it. So it's obvious here that boys and girls in the 9th and 10th grade have clear ideas about appropriateness based on gender. So at these levels and circumstances, gender socialization creates boys and men that have better physical skills than girls and women. I have to make an exception here that's not in your text, which is dance for girls. Actually, male ballet dancers have to catch up with skills and stamina and all of that, flexibility, because girls tend to start ballet and other dance classes early, and that window from 2 to 8 when one really develops that kind of expertise. So that is the one exception there. Now, let's look at varieties of peer culture, because there isn't just one kind of peer culture. So in a wide variety of peer cultures, we learn how to be gendered, right? And sometimes those messages that we learn are, you know, not very helpful to us, either male or female, and can be very destructive. And that this next section talks about boys in disadvantaged neighborhoods. For those boys, gender socialization into masculinity can encourage delinquent and criminal behavior. In a study of 3 Boston neighborhoods, boys who interacted more with older male peers learned a wide range of lessons about how to be a man, including those that legitimized violence and criminality and violence against women as well. A study of Latino and Black men in Oakland, California found that there were few, if any, alternative forms to demonstrating masculinity, to those negative ways of being masculine. Their peers, as well as encounters with police, encouraged them to prove their masculinity through crime, and what ethnographer Elijah Anderson called the young male syndrome. Which is the perceived, expected, and often necessary pressure to perform a tough, violent, and deviant manhood in order to receive respect. This study found that socialization into masculinity reinforced their position in what's called the youth control complex, which is a system of criminalization created by socializing and then the social control of the institutions to deal with the criminalizing. So, in other words, for these boys, the very institutions and groups normally involved in socialization, teachers, parents, friends, assumed that the boys were criminals and socialized them accordingly. So, with that kind of socialization, right, it is difficult even for non-delinquent boys not to be swept into the system of what's called hyper or extreme criminalization. Obviously, this particular version of masculinity learned in this particular culture, particular peer culture, can and often does have long-term negative consequences. And this demonstrates that concept that we learned in chapter 2 of what's called marginalized masculinity. So we're going to talk now about secondary socialization and the fact that learning gender never ends. It never, never, never ends. I'm still learning gender. Everybody is, okay? So up to now, what we've learned about is what's called primary socialization, which is the gender roles we learn, as we talked about, from close primary groups, such as our families and childhood friends, because for most of us, those are our main groups. But as we grow, we increasingly have contact with what are called secondary groups. They're larger, more temporary, more impersonal, and more specialized types of groups. And they generally focus on 2 primary goals. A business, excuse me, a business is a secondary group, okay, with the primary goal of making money. College class is another example of a secondary group. So secondary socialization is the learning process that takes place when we join a new group. In chapter 9, we're going to learn about ways that women and men become socialized in various occupations and what those implications are for inequality as well. So unless you're a hermit, you aren't because you're taking a college class, you join new secondary groups throughout your life. And as a result, gender socialization changes throughout a person's life. One example of that is, as your text heading says, learning to be American, which is socialization through immigration. And I'm sure some of you have experienced that, or your families have, because immigrants and their children have to adapt to the culture of a new country. And that's a good example of how socialization extends beyond childhood and how institutions as large as nations can be agents of socialization. So gender socialization teaches us rules, as we've talked about gender, but how do those rules change as we age? What new rules do we have to learn in our 40s, 60s, or 80s? So what we need for that is what's called a life course perspective. And that looks at how key experiences and social roles influence our lives. So with a life course perspective, here's the points of it. Each life course consists of a biography that changes through exposure to new social settings. It also changes through age, of course. So, for example, having been married will affect how one experiences retirement or old age. Research that combines life course and interactional perspectives reveals results that highlight the important. This is a really important point. It shows us the importance of how other identities, such as age or social class, income, all of those things, race, interact with gender. Life events like marriage, parenthood, and work have different effects of gender ideology. Here we go, depending on racial identity. And this is an interesting finding. For example, marriage is actually more egalitarian, think equal, gender ideology among African Americans, but it's less egalitarian among whites, especially white men. So there are many more examples in the text. I didn't want to take the time to get them all in here at this long lecture, but I want to be aware that there are many more examples like that. So gender socialization, to wrap up here, is an ongoing process. It continues well beyond childhood and adolescence because our life experiences continue to change the way we think about gender in our own lives. And those changes depend on how gender interacts with other categories like race, and ethnicity, as I talked about, social class, even geographic area where one lives, culture, and certainly age. And the rest of this chapter is about age. So, like gender, age is constructed. Okay. So think of the phrase "act your age." That will tell you that age is socially constructed. How do we act our age? Only by what we know is supposed to act our age, which is socialization, what you're supposed to do. So we use this to motivate children to act, quote, more mature, or for older women to remind them that certain activities are, quote, too youthful for them. So while an 18-year-old might stay out all night at a club, for an 80-year-old, it's definitely not age appropriate to do so. If our behaviors were determined only by our biological age, there would be no reason to have to remind people to behave in an age-appropriate manner in order to conform to societal expectations. Now, of course, these ideas change over time and cultures. Okay. In the past and in many cultures today, it's appropriate for children to work, for example, while in other times and cultures, laws and social norms make sure that children don't work. So that's an age appropriate, right? It's appropriate in some cultures for children to actually go to work, and it is not in most Euro-American cultures, although some states are trying to change that in America so that children as young as 14 can work all night. So, just as there are rules about gender that we have to learn, there are also age-related rules, and they overlap with gender. So, for instance, very young girls are not supposed to dress in ways that accentuate their sexuality, but neither are older women. Okay? Older women are expected to both believe and behave that they're no longer sexually attractive and dress in ways that minimize their sexuality. If they don't conform, they're likely to be seen as rebels, eccentric, or I love this one, desperate. So these rules about Women's sexuality as they age are an example of what's called ageism. I'm sure you're familiar with that term. It's prejudice based on a preference for youth and equating aging with decreased social value. So, as you might expect by now, right, aging has very different effects on men and on women. Because more emphasis is placed on women's attractiveness than on men's, women lose more esteem as they age. Because as men age, they replace, qualities such as handsomeness and physical prowess, looks, with an emphasis on success and gains in wisdom, skill, and money, of course. Rupert Murdoch, as you may know, at 93, is marrying, I can't remember what wife, third now, a young woman. Well, when you're as rich as Rupert Murdoch, you can do that. His status is really as a male at 93 has not decreased that much. Now think about a 93-year-old woman, marrying a, I don't know how old she is, 35-year-old man, let's say, and how societal norms would react to that. What about the gender of caregiving and Alzheimer's, for example? It's an important issue in aging. Who's going to care for you in your old age, especially in the United States, because we have this enormous aging population of baby boomers, which is increasing dramatically every year. 18% of Americans care for either a child or a parent, and 60% of them are women, and 2/3 of those caring for Alzheimer patients are women. Now, it isn't really surprising, of course, due to gender socialization, that women are more likely to be involved in caregiving because that's our expectation that that's women's work. It's a feminine activity as well as is nurturing and emotional support. And it's interesting because men, as recipients of care, often experience their loss of autonomy and control as emasculating. Driving is an important example. When men can't drive anymore, it's much more of a dramatic event for them, generally, according to research, than it is for women, because their women's identity is not nearly as wrapped up in being able to drive as men's is. Okay, so how do we wrap? Let's wrap this up. Okay, so summing up this chapter on gender socialization, our attachment to our gender identities is not surprising because our gender lives begin even before we leave the womb, as we talked about, because we're entering into societies that have already made decisions about how our sex and gender will be determined and what that means for our lives. So, as we've talked about, even those whose biological makeup doesn't fit with established gender categories, intersex individuals, they are indoctrinated within a gender system. So it's really important to think about your gender socialization and pay attention too to what you see around you, because it helps us to think about the nature of gender as a primarily social phenomenon. All right, that's the end of chapter 4.